Now, if you're a follower of Jesus and sometimes you wonder, what am I actually here for? Or you felt guilty because you haven't evangelized enough, or you're just tired of hearing the same thing, but you know deep down that there has got to be more, then this video is for you. Recently I read and listened to a book by Christopher Wright titled The Mission of God's People, Who We Are and What We Are Here For. And it explained in detail for many of us what we're missing, which is our idea of being on mission. And if you don't know me, my name is Toyoshimbi. I've been a follower of Jesus for over 30 years, but each day I am still learning. I'm the founder of LifesPriority with my wife, and we just want to help people put God first. And so I want to just share things with you. And today, I think, as I summarize the essentials of this book, that it is really going to help us have the right perspective towards what we are here for. The stats are showing that many young adults, especially in the UK, are coming to faith. Now, my concern is that they don't get taught the wrong things about God and his kingdom. So if you watch this and if it makes sense, please pass it on, subscribe, and later I'll be sharing with you more of these things, and I'll also be sharing with you how you can get these slides that I'm going to be showing for free. I will encourage you to also read the book because it covers a lot more and it is very biblical. Some concepts you might be aware of, but many parts might be quite new, and you might also have some aha moments. And so for those moments, please write them in the comments. So let's get right into it as I share what I have taken away from this book, The Mission of God's People. So let's kick off. First and foremost, I'm just going to read one of the key things that he's mentioning here is that it's not that God has a mission for his church, but that God has a church for his mission. And the idea is that there are ways of how we have seen the situation, the misconception about missions, right? Which is the focus is about sending and being sent. The common association is cross-cultural evangelism, foreign countries, professional missionaries. And so the analogy is almost like there's a specific variation between physics and biology and chemistry, and they're sort of separated where we need to be on mission. But the reality is that there is only one real mission, which is God's purpose. And so the purpose and goal, right? When we look at this from the scriptural perspective, it arises from the heart of God. The reason the church exists is for God's mission, right? And so it's like science, not physics, biology, chemistry. It's the universal concept, the method and the ethos. So the key insight that is, if everything is mission, then everything is mission. Not everything is cross-cultural evangelism, but everything a Christian does is missional participation. And as we're going to see, this is the reason why I'm very passionate about this, is because over the years, I myself have realized that I am living a dichotomy where there's the work life and then there's your sort of spiritual realm, if that makes sense, and speaking to many believers, we sometimes switch off from our 9 to 5 and not necessarily see how that is part of missions, especially when it's got nothing to do exactly with helping people come to faith. Maybe you're doing admin work you're a clerk, or whatever it is, that sometimes what we're doing is so far removed from us seeing it as missional. And unfortunately, sometimes within the community that we're in, it doesn't get elevated, it doesn't get valued. And so we sometimes tend to be in this environment where we are also shown through what is elevated, what is celebrated, that, or what you're doing isn't of value to God, which is wrong, but that's just necessarily how we feel. And so we cannot know our role if we do not know the story. Now, I have a video called The Kingdom Story where I break down the entire Bible. You can find it on LifesPriority on the YouTube channel. Here is Christopher's way of describing the same thing, right? That there is creation, there's the call of Abraham, which is the election, there's the fall. Now, he puts Abraham there, but obviously we know that the fall actually happens in Genesis chapter 3, right? That's the fall. And then there's redemption, all right? In fact, after the fall, everything after the fall is redemption, but we clearly see the call of Abraham being the part of the redemption where God calls Abraham and says that he's going to use him to be a blessing to the nations, right? And then we see all the way up to the New Testament before Jesus comes, which is a pivotal moment. The cross is the most significant event that has happened on the planet, and because it brings in a new covenant. And now we will be in that section that's called Mission of Church, which I, in my own kingdom phrase, I would use that these are the last days, because the only thing we're waiting for is Jesus' second coming. The consummation, it's called, right? The resurrection and the new creation. Now, it is important for all of us to understand this entire story. The Bible doesn't begin at the fall. It begins with creation. It doesn't end at judgment. It ends with new creation. Those 2 points are so important, but what we tend to focus on in the typical age that we're in many of our denominations and churches, we talk about just salvation, being saved from sin, which is only part of the story, not the recreation of the entire world itself. Jesus' view in Luke 24, Jesus taught the whole story and how the scriptures led up to the Messiah and onto mission. And so our mission flows from the prior mission of God. And so what's important? First, identity, right? The first Great Commission, creation, care is not a trend. It is our first mandate, right? And so we are created as God's image, kings who represent the Creator. We rule as God rules, with wisdom and protection, not tyranny. And so we're here to serve and keep, right? Humanity was placed in the garden to work, serve, and protect. Keep it. That is the mandate from Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, and Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. Mission is not just about the church. It's about the entire cosmos. And this is the reason why I was so excited about reading this book, because it gives us a bigger perspective. And one of the things that I have learned myself is that perspective matters. In fact, everything that we do comes out of our perspective. And so if you only have a tunnel vision perspective, we only see the tunnel vision. If you have a greater perspective of what God has called us to be and to do, then it helps all of us work towards that when we see things from his perspective. So we are earth creatures, right? Adam, we're human. And so the point that he makes here is shared glory. All creation exists to praise God. Caring for creation is an act of worship. You know, when God put man on the planet, it's a partnership. You know, take care of my property. So we are stewards of God's creation, and we are in partnership with him. And then human sin is what caused this whole stress. The land mourns because of the wickedness in the land. You know, we chose to disobey God, and that's why we're suffering. But then there's a shared destiny. Redemption includes the physical world. God reconciles all things through the cross. And so Jesus' coming was to redeem all things, not just a few things, not just save us from our sin, but the entire cosmos is to be redeemed. And so in his whole idea of bringing this to fruition, he chose one person, which is Abraham. And he uses Abraham as the pivotal person that all nations are going to be blessed by. And in the book, he really goes into depth about what we can learn and why Abraham is called the father of the faith. So identity 2, blessed to be a blessing, the Abrahamic pivot, right? God chose Abraham. God chose one, Abraham, for the sake of many. Election is instrumental, like choosing one explorer to squeeze through a gap to rescue the whole group. This answers the question, and I know sometimes people think about this, which is that what about the person in Mongolia? What about the person in that place who has never heard of the gospel? Well, when you think about God's intent, God had to start somewhere. And so God started with Abraham, and then Abraham became, through his descendants, a nation, and the nation then became the nation to bless all nations. And as you can see, when we see things from that perspective, I hope you can see that it all makes sense. The gospel link, Galatians 3:8, calls the promise the gospel in advance. Let's move on. So what was it that God called Abraham to do? To walk in the way of the Lord. Genesis 18 verse 19. He was chosen, right, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, and then the mission so that the Lord may bring about the blessing to the nations. So the insight is ethics is the middle term between election and mission. We must be different from Sodom to save Sodom. And so God called Abraham out to be an example and then to be a blessing. So the vocabulary of mission, which is, it's sadaka, I think is the correct pronunciation. And then there's mishpat, which is justice. And so these are ways of how we show this, we are on mission. So sadaka means right relationship, doing what is right by the standard of the relationship. So in family, social, business, honest weights, safe paths, doing what is right, living the right way. And then also putting things right, active interventions to save the oppressed, to hear the cry of the victims and to demonstrate justice. So those two words form one concept, which is social justice. And then also redeemed for a purpose, right? And so what we find here is that the redemption, the story of Exodus, gives us the classic example. It refers to a kinsman protector who pays the cost to release a family member from debt or slavery. And so the Exodus also teaches us the model of what it really means to be redeemed, and that God himself said, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will take you as my own. And so here's the main point that I think is important for us to understand. A lot of times we might say, when we think about redemption, we just think in spiritual. But what we learn from the Old Testament is that God wanted to redeem the children of Israel politically. They were being liberated to become a free people. Economically, they were being liberated from slavery into ownership. Social, they were being liberated and to be restored so that their families can be protected and they can reinstate that, aspect. And then spiritually, from the service of Pharaoh to the service of God. In fact, that's what Moses says, I want to call my people out so we can worship God. Now, when you think about what's happening today, this is really important. In fact, I preached a few weeks ago and I talked about how when we think about the busyness of life and everything today, isn't it true that this is exactly what most of us are yearning for, which is to be redeemed from our political situation, to be a free people where we can make choices and we can live in harmony. In fact, that's what the prayer is. In First Timothy, we should pray for our leaders so that we can live in peace and harmony, not under threat, not in chaos. When we think about economically, there's so much of a burden, people losing jobs and everything, people in debt. And so we want to be restored to own things so that we have that aspect of the things that we are taking care of and we're in positions to take care of others. Socially, the situation in our world today is breaking down families. God wants to restore that. And then obviously spiritually as well, where we're free to worship our God in freedom. This is one of the key takeaways from the book, is that it gives a holistic perspective of what redemption really means. And it then shows us that it's not only an Old Testament thing, it's a New Testament aspect through the cross. The cross is the ultimate exodus. Jesus spoke of his departure on the mount with Moses and Elijah, which represented the books of Moses and the law and the prophets. And the cross is God's victory over all that enslaves sin, death, demonic powers, and injustice. And it's important for us to know this because the Bible and the power of the resurrection disarms the powers and authorities, and creation itself will be liberated from bondage. So a holistic theology of the cross is what supports holistic mission. And it looks something like this. Living redemptively. In the Old Testament, there was the Jubilee, where there was economic release, debt forgiveness, family restoration. In the New Testament, we see this being applied. Forgiveness. Jesus, when he in the Lord's Prayer, is about forgive us our debtors. So there's a spiritual aspect to it. This being called to be generous, being called for equality, treating others as brothers and sisters. The followers of Jesus are to live as both recipients of and participants in a permanent jubilee. And what does that then look like? So the whole gospel, the whole church, the whole world, we have a message big enough to redeem all that sin has touched. Creation, society, and the soul. It is not only the soul. A lot of times we are content by saying, oh, this person came to Christ and that's it. But we don't always see that there's a bigger picture to redeem the marketplace, to redeem creation. The mission is the global outreach of the global people of a global God. This has consequences. Where you're working, whatever you're doing, you are part and you are a believer and follower of Christ. I want to encourage you to have that perspective that you are part of God's global mission. You don't have to wait to sign up in your church to go on mission. You don't have to wait to go on missions week. You see, that's the problem that we have today, is we've categorized mission as some kind of task rather than as we go about, we are on mission. So the grand narrative is that we are stewards, we are heirs to this blessing from God, we are servants, redemptive through our redemptive living, we are citizens of the kingdom, and we can look forward to the healings of the nation on this side of the world and obviously in the world to come. So this, I hope, has given us some perspective around how we should start to view ourselves as God's people on mission. And so there could be some questions, and these are some of the questions that the book, as I said, I'll really encourage you to get the book, read the book, but it's supposed to help us, moving from, is this biblical, to are we living the story? So do we rule creation as tyrants or as servants of the King? So whenever we're in charge of things, how are we ruling? Are we ruling as servants of the King? When it comes to the economic side, do our lifestyles reflect the Jubilee generosity of the gospel? When it comes to the social side, are we Sodom, which is apathetic to the outcry, or Abraham doing justice? And when it comes to evangelistic, are we sharing the story of the God who redeems? It's the entire redemption of all creation. So there is no biblical mission without biblical ethics. Who are we? We are the people of God's mission, which means that wherever we go, we should take the mission with us. Now, if you want more summaries like this, like and subscribe. And as I said, I believe God is doing something in our time, and you can join the conversation, subscribe to this channel, and also join the community at LifesPriority.org/co, where you will get access to these slides as well as continue the conversation. This is Toyo Shimbi for Life's Priority. Speak to you next time.